And we're back on New Talk, the opposite of old talk, here on STV, Real TV. And we had Levi shared something really interesting that I want to interrogate a little bit more about the male objectifying gaze, right? And what crosses my mind is, if any of you all have YouTube or even Instagram or Facebook, there's one kind of female that kind of gets real space on social media, that gets all the likes and all the shares and all the fans and all the friends. And that person kind of has to be overtly attractive in order to survive on social media, in order to get what social media has to offer. And the question becomes, are women doing that in order to achieve the male gaze? Or is the male gaze forcing women to portray themselves in these manners? And I don't know if there's anything that you could add to that, Levi.
I don't think it's an either-or situation. I don't think the male objectifying gaze is basically pulling the strings for women. I think it's much more complex and fluid than that. Women have a right to self-determination. If they want to wear makeup and sort of do their hair and wear a dress and sort of be attractive, then they should do that and they have that right. I don't think it's necessarily a case that the male objectifying gaze is pulling the strings or turning them into a robot. So there's issues basically of self-determination and women having sexual agency and exercising those things, exercising autonomy. That's also taking place within a context of, I think, heteropatriarchy. And so basically the predominant systems that we exist in are very heterosexual. It creates beauty norms and particular standards that people try to live up to. That's problematic, but at the same time, it can be very liberating and an act of self-determination as well as agency for a woman to dress and make herself look how she wants. So I don't think it's a cut and dry causal relationship. I think it's much more complex. The structures and the predominant notions that we're existing in influence those things, just as our own personal agency and a woman's personal agency in terms of putting on makeup or a dress or being influenced by beauty standards. So it's not one thing or the other. I think it's a recursive relationship.
Okay, you all agree with that?
Well, to some extent, yes, because I feel like in some cases, there are women that feel that they acknowledge and they are aware of the fact that men are going to watch them if they act or dress in a certain way. So they're very cognizant of that. And because of the nature of our society, very patriarchal, like men's opinions and having weight or whatever, they try to achieve power in that way, if that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah? So in some cases, that is what it is. And in some cases, it would be just, I worked out and I am achieving what I would like to achieve, so I'm going to Instagram a picture of my abs that I just got. But in some cases, it is that you're aware that, okay, in order to get a certain amount of likes, I need to have a certain amount of cleavage, a certain amount, it depends, it becomes dependent on the person. So I don't want to generalize and say all women do it because of men, or all don't. It's kind of both, and it depends on who you are, what you believe.
Okay, so I believe that social media has spread a ground for insecurities and a lack of self-love, and the fact that women see it fit to dress up and post a picture just to please a man, to get likes, to get recognition from him, it's kind of disturbing. Nobody no longer says, okay, well, I'm going to put on a dress and I'm going to comb my hair because I just feel like being pretty today. And to me, that bothers me a lot. It really does.
Okay, and I wanna connect to that really quickly. A lot of the backlash after the Simmons ruling, not just to Ms. Ho, but to people in general, young women in general, how they deal with themselves on social media. The concern for a lot of folks was that women, in order to portray themselves in these ways at all, obviously don't have respect for themselves. And I have a big problem with that, right? Because how a woman portrays herself has nothing to do with what kind of person you think she is. It has to do with how she represents herself. But that's the defense that men have been using for years. Not just around revenge porn, but around how women deal with themselves in social media in general, how young women are dressing, how they think women are behaving as against how they should behave. What are we missing in terms of educating men towards the idea that women aren't competing for your respect, they're just competing for the ability to survive and like to live like normal human beings in this space. Yeah, what's the missing conversation there? What's the missing thread?
Well, I think that has a lot to do with how we are socialized. Like that starts from young, from birth. Like girls are policed way more, they're harder than boys. So like a girl, you have to dress properly, you have to, you know, behave yourself in a certain way, while boys, if they misbehave, it's like, oh, boys will be boys. That's just how they are. They will mature soon. But girls are like, no, you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to look this way, and you can't act like a certain way. Like I remember specifically, like with my brothers and I, because I have 4 brothers, and there's just me, a girl. And so I see it every single day. I need to be escorted to the shop by one of my younger brothers. And it's just like...
By your younger brother?
By my younger brothers. I am older, so it starts from that, the home. And it just manifests itself, it just gets bigger. And I feel like social media just kind of blows that up, like on a world stage, basically. Right. So we get that. I think it comes from there. So in order, I feel to adjust, we need to adjust like how we treat girls and how we treat boys from that age, so that they see each other in that way, like equally, because that's not how it is now. So yeah. Okay.
So what keeps on crossing my mind when we talk about revenge porn, like what bothers me is that men share nudes too, right? Probably just as much, maybe even, I'm willing to bet even more so than women, right? And I could put that on TV. I think men share nudes more than women, right? But how they are judged for that is vastly different. In fact, to some degree, I think folks think that if a young man is not showing himself off to get a woman's attention in these ways, yeah? Because that's how social media has kind of transformed how we court one another, yeah? You start messaging for a little while, and then you start asking for a little picture. Yeah? If young men don't do that, then something's wrong with them. Maybe they're not completely heterosexual. Maybe they have some sort of image issue. Maybe they're just a punk, right? Because we find all kind of ways to demean men for not doing what we demean women for doing, right? And I don't know if there's anything that, like, what really is the cause of that? Like, how do we hold these two groups accountable equally?
Well, I think specifically, like, I tend to look at myself. I've never asked a guy for a picture of himself. And I think that has to do with...
Have you ever received
the
one?
way... No.
Okay.
But I think it has to do with the way, again, it has to do with how, like, we court each other or whatever. Usually, or what is, like, traditional is that the man would court the woman. So he would be the one, you know, like, okay, let's... You know, like making the first move to talk. So it would, I think... that would come, it has to do with who has, like, I don't know the power, I don't want to use that word, but I can't find another one, but it's like, who takes the lead, kind of, in cases like that. So like the man, he would, you know, and ask for these things, or offer these things, so it's not necessarily that the woman asks, or in that situation. So I do kind of understand why, yeah, it is a thing, but yeah, it has to.
Okay, so I'll have to agree with you on your prior point in terms of socialization. So I believe, you know, socialization plays a vital role in how we see men and women. And I believe men, they believe they have this image to upkeep, and they are deemed as the more macho and the more, I don't know how to put it, but they are the ones who will court the woman, and they should take the lead. And we as women sit and we believe this, and therefore we kind of unconsciously subject ourselves to how men perceive us to be. And I believe that's really the problem there, you know, the rooted problem. And once we could deviate from that perspective of how we believe a man should see us, that is when change will really, really take place.
Okay. The term revenge porn, the term revenge porn, I'm still trying to work my head around it, right? This is really for you, Levi. Is that it's one thing for someone to share someone's images without their consent, and there's a completely other thing to do it out of revenge. In the Simmons case, it was clearly a case of revenge. In fact, Mr. Simmons said so himself. in testimony. But with the case of Nikisha Cornwall, who just sent her phone to be repaired and someone saw the pictures and was out of timing, right?
Exactly.
Is that another, do we need another framework to discuss that in particular? Or because it's not revenge porn in the sense that they didn't have a relationship that he was trying to renegotiate by embarrassing her. He was just a weird guy who saw someone's photos and put it up on social media.
Right.
Yeah. The subsequent case where the employer heard about the sharing of the images and decided to share it again, that was revenge. But the original case was just a guy being out of time. Do we need two different ways to discuss these two different phenomena?
I think so, and it's like in the case you're talking about, it isn't necessarily revenge porn. It's an egregious violation of privacy. So we have that terminology that exists. It's just, I think, unique, or it seems a bit different because it's surrounding social media as well as sort of digital sharings of photographs, and then the context of taking a computer in and then having that violation to take place. So it may not necessarily be rooted in revenge, so to speak, but it's rooted in basically, it's rooted in power relations and just humiliation. Like, I'm going to humiliate someone. That's an act of trying to exert power, as well as even dominate someone. And it's not a physical, overt act of power, but it's a much more subtle, insidious way of exposing and subordinating and dominating someone in order to do nothing more than just humiliate them. And in many cases, once again, in terms of violations of privacy surrounding photographs, as well as we mentioned earlier in revenge porn, men are committing these crimes more than women. So it may not necessarily fall under the framework of revenge porn, but we do have that language, and that's the language of violating privacy.
Right.
And that's exactly what's taking place.
Right. And it's interesting that you would say that we have the language for that. Currently in Trinidad and Tobago, we do not have an active cybercrime legislation, which would have been the legislation we would use to properly have judged the Simmons case. We don't have legislation like that. We also don't have a gender policy in this country either, even though we've passed through like a draft every 3 years, right? We've had a draft of the gender bill every 3 years that people see, but it never sees the light of Parliament in any sort of real substantial way. We lack two essential documents that allow us to have conversations about how to protect women against abuses like revenge porn in more real and substantial ways. I want to ask a challenging question. Which one should come first?
In that what?
Between cybercrime legislation and a gender policy, in terms of dealing with issues such as these, how these things overlap?
I think a gender policy should come first because we need to know what the crime is in order to, enforce it.
Right.
Basically, so there would need to be that definition that's clear, in
Right.
order to have clear enforcement based on what the crime that is committed. So I think that the gender policy would have to come first.
Okay. Do you think
we would have to?
What do you think is holding us back from reaching that point?
Yes, it has to do with how we see sex. Like, that is something that we do not talk about. We don't talk about it in the home. We don't want to talk about it in school unless it's from like a scientific perspective. So that whole not wanting to talk about gender comes from it's all connected in that sense. And because we don't want to talk about it, we have these problems and they keep occurring over and over and over. And we can't find a solution because we do not want to talk about it.
Right. Well then, okay, so then let me ask a challenge, again, turn it in line with the first question. Wouldn't it be easier to come up with a cybercrime legislation that is not gender specific? We don't have a conversation about, and I'm not necessarily saying that we shouldn't have a conversation about gender, but if we have another series of legislative tools, right, that are not gender specific, don't we create a greater framework for the political will that allows us to get a gender policy? In the sense that a cybercrime legislation would protect men and women from the exact same wrongs without us having to have a conversation about what the gender policy should and should not have. Because that's the problem that we've had, is that politicians get scared when we talk about particular groups in the gender policy, and it just keeps on getting squashed.
Yeah.
And I think what's important in terms of the gender policy is not to conflate the word gender with just woman. Because the gender policy very much will affect men as well as women, as well as transgender people, as well as queer folks. So it's important whenever discussions take place in the public discourse not to just basically specifically say this is about women. And a gender policy and a cybercrime policy, if it's part of the gender policy, can be applied to genders along the entire continuum. And it's also important, and it's a little befuddling that there isn't a gender policy or that it's not been ratified or made official, just because there are a lot of gender issues that affect men. So men are dying sooner, men go to war, men oftentimes don't seek help for mental health issues, they suffer rates of depression that go unreported. Those are all part of a gender policy as well. Oftentimes what's problematic about saying those things about men or masculinity is then we oftentimes sort of, here's negative things about life that men are facing, then immediately for some reason people blame women. That's not sort of the issue.
Yeah.
The issue, the underlying issue is basically rigid notions of what manhood is. And so in terms of not making a gender-specific policy, but having the gender policy that applies to all genders, including issues of cyber rape or revenge porn or cybercrime, I think those could, I don't think they're mutually exclusive in terms of the gender or even the legislation surrounding cybercrime versus other issues of gender.
All right, and as you can see, everything's connected over here. Even though we're just talking about revenge porn, it's a much larger conversation about gender and sexuality here in Trinidad and Tobago. You are watching New Talk. We'll be back right after these short messages.